resurrection. And we think that we get to step into that reality. And so, Father, as we open your word and as we just ask that you would be speaking to us by your word and by your spirit. Meet us where we are at, we ask in your name. Amen. You may be seated. Well, good morning to you all. Happy Easter. He is risen. He's risen indeed. Yes. Well, hey, I just want to say good morning. And my name is Jonathan. And for those who don't know me, I'm a pastor here, and just so glad that you joined us this morning, that we get to come together on an Easter morning like this and celebrate our risen Lord. You know, at this exact moment in time, and actually in even the hours preceding this, if you were to go around the globe to the other side of the world, there are millions and millions of people around the world and on every continent who are celebrating the most incredible reality. The reality that God became a human. He became a man, just like you and I, and he lived his life on earth among us. And that he went to the cross and he took on all of our sin and guilt and shame, and he bore that on our behalf and took that away from us. And then he went to the grave, and 3 days later, he rose to victorious, indestructible life. That is the reality that we celebrate this morning. That is why we are here. That is the claim of Easter. That is the claim of millions around the world. That is the claim of the biblical witnesses. And quite frankly, if we just stop and think about it for just a moment, this should raise some questions for us. I mean, if the story of Easter, if the cross and the resurrection doesn't do something in you, whether you believe in God or not, but if it doesn't astonish you or perplex you or confuse you, or perhaps disturb you, or at the very least, if it doesn't give you some curiosity rising up inside of you, I want you to turn to the person next to you that you came with and say, can you check my pulse? Because this is the most amazing reality that we get to celebrate here this morning. You see, at the core of the Christian faith is not simply just a set of doctrines and beliefs. At the core of our faith is not simply a set of morals and ethics. At the center of our faith in Jesus is a cross and an empty tomb. That is the core of our faith in the God of the Bible. Everything else flows out from that reality. And so this morning, as we open the Word, I want to just invite you to turn to John chapter 20 with me. We're going to look at one of the accounts of the resurrection in the Gospel of John. John chapter 20. I forgot to look and see what page it was in the blue Bibles, but if you don't have a Bible, grab a blue Bible there. Open up to the New Testament and flip to the Gospel of John chapter 20. Now there are a lot of, in the New Testament, there are so many passages and verses and texts that we have on the cross and resurrection and on its cosmic scope. But what I want to do this morning is I want to bring us to one of the accounts that gets really personal, okay? It says this in John chapter 20, starting in verse 1. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved. This is John, by the way. And said, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb and we don't know where they have put him. So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple, John, outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and he looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. I love how some translations say it was folded in place. Finally, the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went inside. This is John. He saw and he believed. They still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to where they were staying. Now, Mary stood outside the tomb crying, and as she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. And they asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They've taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they have put him." At this, she turned around and she saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it that you are looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." And Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and to your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. This is the word of the Lord for us this morning. And it's a remarkable story. Mary Magdalene was this woman who had experienced the love and grace and freedom of Jesus in her past. He had seen the worst of her. She had been in a dark place. If you look in the Gospel of Luke, you'll see that she had been demonically oppressed, and Jesus had freed her from that torment. And so here she is on the third day after Jesus had been crucified and killed. And she arrives at the tomb of Jesus bringing spices, as was the custom, to anoint the body, to honor and to show affection for someone that she loved dearly. It was still dark outside. I don't know if she couldn't sleep. I don't know if she just simply wanted to be there as early as possible. But it's not only dark at that moment in the morning right before the dawn, it was dark in Mary's own world, in her internal world, in her experience that she was having. Her rabbi and friend, Jesus, had been brutally and horrifically killed just days before. And we just participated in communion this morning to remember that, to give thanks for the sacrifice of Jesus on our behalf as he took on our sins and took them away from us, covered them over, as Bert said. So she goes to the tomb to do this. But when she gets there, this stone that had been rolled over the entrance had been removed. She immediately concludes someone must have taken his body. And so she runs to alert the other disciples. She goes to Peter and John and tells them what had happened. And they waste no time. They run to the tomb as fast as they can. And apparently John is a faster runner than Peter. Who knew? You know, if you look in the scriptures, you see Peter can outrun people with his mouth, but apparently not with his legs. But they get there, and Peter doesn't hesitate like John does. Even though John gets there first, Peter doesn't hesitate to rush into the tomb to see what was there. And they saw the same thing. There was nothing to see. The linen that he was wrapped in is folded up in the place that he had been laid. And then we're told that John, as he steps in, he sees and he believes. He sees and he believes. They don't realize, they don't remember that Jesus had been teaching them all along that this had to happen, that he had to go to the cross, that he would be dead for several days, and that he would rise again to life. They didn't realize this at the moment, but they knew something had happened. When you put a body into a tomb, the tomb is not empty 3 days later. That is not something that happens. They knew something had happened. And then the story promptly exits these two men, these two characters, from the scene. Okay? They tell us they went back to where they were staying. They probably went back to tell those what they saw, what they knew. They maybe perhaps went back to not be found in the tomb when authorities came by. I mean, that's not a situation you want to find yourself in. Hey, it wasn't us, but who else is around? In the first 10 verses of this passage, there is a lot of movement. There's excitement. There's confusion. There's emotions. But at the heart of this story that I want to get in with you this morning, this particular resurrection account, what the heart of this story lies in what comes next. And this is where things slow down. This is where things get personal. This is where things come into focus and we start to see what is taking place. How does someone move on when the worst has occurred and then things keep unraveling as if things couldn't get worse, but they continue to get worse? What does someone do when the tragically unexpected has happened, only to be followed by another unexpected twist? These are some of the questions swirling around in these first verses, these disciples and Mary wondering what's going on. Notice that Mary is the one who stays. Mary is the one who stands outside the tomb. Mary is the one who starts to inquire as to where the body of Jesus is. The other two men left in a hurry, but Mary stays behind. And with tears streaming down her face, she works up the courage to peek inside the tomb. And she sees two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been laid. "Woman," one of them asks, "why are you crying?" It's an odd question, I think at least, on the face of it. We have 20/20 vision with hindsight. We see what happens down the road. We know what has happened. We know that this is Jesus resurrected from the dead. Mary had no idea what was going on in this moment. I mean, Jesus had been violently killed just days before, and now his body is gone. One could forgive Mary for visibly expressing the traumatic events that she's witnessed, right? The emotions that are rising to the surface. "They've taken my Lord away," she says, "and I don't know where they've put him. I don't know what's going on. None of this has made sense in the last 3 days, and this is just another thing that doesn't make sense." Let me ask you, have you ever been overwhelmed by a situation that you couldn't make sense of what was right in front of you? Have you ever been overwhelmed by a situation or by circumstances, and you've had trouble hearing what other people are saying to you right in front of you? You've had trouble speaking to someone who's looking for a response. You've had trouble understanding what's going on. I remember when my wife, Michelle, went into delivery for our daughter, Selah, and things had been progressing well, and then things didn't progress well. And before we knew it, they were rushing my wife off to the emergency room for emergency C-section. That's a moment where I didn't know what was up, what was down, what was left, what was right. I kissed Michelle and I prayed as they took her away, and I don't even know what I prayed. I don't even know, that the whole experience was a blur. And there are those moments when you just don't know what to do. You don't know how to respond. Everything is moving both fast and slow at the same time, and you are overwhelmed. And many of you have experienced those things in your life. You've experienced the traumatic. You've experienced the grief. You know what I'm talking about. And at this moment, Mary is she's looking at two angels. But she is so caught up in the moment of confusion and bewilderment and what is going on. She doesn't even recognize them. I don't even know if she recognizes them as angels. Where is his body gone? Who could have done this? Why would someone do this? I mean, if she had even just mistook them for two men, for two humans, two people, isn't it possible that they would know what had happened? They're sitting in the empty tomb. Hey, did you see what happened? I don't know. Did you see? Like, she doesn't even recognize that there are two angels sitting there. She's so caught up in the mess of it all. The ways that trauma and grief can really easily take a hold of us and take us out of reality into an alternate reality, right? And then she turns to face away from the tomb and she sees another figure. She sees a man standing there. And he too asks her, "Woman, why are you crying?" But he then follows up with this question, "Who is it that you are looking for?" And what follows is, I think, a tragically underrated line in the New Testament. In the second half of verse 15, thinking he was the gardener. Thinking he was the gardener. We've entered spring, at least in the last couple of days. It's felt like that. We'll see what happens in the coming weeks. But we've entered spring, and some of you are already starting to plan and dream and scheme about your gardening plans. There's those of you who like to get out in your yard, and you like to muck around in the soil and get busy in these weeks ahead, right? And winter has felt like an awfully long time by this point. But think about gardening for a moment with me. Why do we do it? Why do we garden? Well, we do it to cultivate and facilitate life. We do it to bring generation and beauty and new creation at our place. My Ukrainian Baba, who was a feisty 4'10" woman who just passed away last year, she was passionate about gardening. And I can remember her working in her garden and helping my mom in our garden. The gloves, the dirt, the tools, the sweat, the possibilities that were there. What was she envisioning? What was she seeing and working towards? How would this thing turn out? Because if you know anything about gardening, sometimes you know that it gets really, really messy, right? It can look like a disaster to those from the outside looking in, not sure what the end product is supposed to be. But it's the process of cultivating and readying things for life and beauty to flourish. And in this moment, things are a disaster for Mary. She turns to this gardener, okay, and she says, "Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you've put him and I will get him." What boldness she had. Tell me where you put him. Tell me where they put him, and I will get him. And Jesus says to her one word. He just says her name, Mary. And that changes everything. At this moment, she knew not only with her head, but she knew with her heart who he was. And all the doubt and all the grief and all the worries were gone in that moment. I love that Jesus has to tell her, "Don't hold on to me." Like she's clinging to him. Her weeping turning into joy. "Teacher, it is you. It is you." If you look in Isaiah 51, verse 3, the prophet says this, "The Lord will surely comfort Zion and will look with compassion on all her ruins. He will make her deserts like Eden, her wastelands like the garden of the Lord. Joy and gladness will be found in her, thanksgiving and the sound of singing." Now, I think it's somewhat unfair, if I can just be honest, to say that Mary mistook Jesus for a gardener. Because it's not entirely untrue that God is like a gardener in many respects. God's cultivating and generating and bringing about new life and beauty is an overriding theme in the scriptures. From Genesis to Revelation, you see this. You see, the act of gardening that we participate in every spring is actually a great analogy for who God is and for what he does, and to what Easter is all about. Now, the tomb of Jesus was located just outside the Jerusalem city walls, and it was placed in a garden. Where else have you seen a garden in the scriptures? When God creates the world, he has a garden in a place called Eden, and he puts people into this garden. And if you're familiar with the story, you'll remember that our first mother and father go on to make a mess of things, and we continue on in their footsteps to this day, don't we? But the story of God and of humans begins in a garden where everything is going well, and then sin enters the picture and things start to crumble. They fall apart. But here in our story, if you fast forward from Genesis all the way to the Gospel of John, here in our story, the new creation that God is setting into motion also begins in a garden. When things aren't going so well, when the worst has happened, and when sin has done the worst that it can do, new life springs up. You see, in the resurrection, Jesus proves that his sacrifice wasn't just to deal with sin. It was to conquer and to stand over death itself. That is what he accomplished. Without the resurrection, as Paul says, We are to be pitied, for the cross means nothing. But in light of the resurrection, the cross becomes everything. 1 Corinthians 15 calls Jesus the first fruits of those who slept. That is, the first of many who will be raised out of death and into new life. My friends, our God is a God who unleashes new possibilities. He's a God who unleashes hope right here in the midst of our current circumstances and situations, in the midst of doubt, in the midst of pain, in the midst of shame and guilt and anxieties and regrets, you name it. God is unleashing new possibilities and new hopes for you and for I and for us here and today. And God promises that what happened to Jesus is just the beginning. 1 Peter 1:3 tells us he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. And then if you jump to Revelation 21, verse 5, Christ himself says what? He says, I am making all things new. And so here we are, sitting in Sturgeon County, Alberta, 2,000 years later. And here we are in following Jesus, the risen one. We are called to participate in this new thing that he is doing. We are called to participate in the new life that God is bringing into our world, in the light of the cross and resurrection, and in light of what God will eventually do at the end. It's like when parents tell their kids, you're going on a holiday, right? How many parents have done this? You tell your kids, we're not going for a few more weeks, but they're already there. They are there. They're packing their bag. They are talking to their friends about it. They are excited for it. They're making plans for it. Even if it's weeks away, they are already going on vacation. My friends, I realize that it's abstract at best to talk about the resurrection right now. Because right now, things are not as they should be. The world is not as it should be. God has yet to return and to make all things new as he promises he will. But he's given us a promise because of Jesus rising from the dead, that is going to be our certain hope for those of us who put our faith in Christ. He is going to remake all things and make all things new. And we get to live in light of that hope and in that anticipation. Pack your bags because we're going on vacation. We're going somewhere. My friends, Jesus Christ is alive and well. He has conquered Satan, sin, and death through his cross and resurrection, and he will one day make all things new. And so the invitation that we have today is to participate in that, to live in light of that here and now. And like I said, even though we don't fully experience it in all of its fullness, we look to God and we say, what you did for Jesus, what you did for him on that third day, you're going to do for me, you're going to do for us, you're going to do for this world. That is the hope that we look to. Show me, God, how to live in light of that. Because my friends, the gardener is coming back. The gardener will return, and he will tend and weed and bring life, his life, in all of its fullness. And the world will flourish as it's meant to, as heaven comes to earth. And so saying yes to the resurrection on a morning like today is not simply saying yes to a set of beliefs or doctrines, although we can talk about it in those ways. Saying yes to the resurrection is saying yes to a whole new reality and to a promise of God. And so what Easter calls us to do is to throw ourselves into that new thing that God is doing, to cling to the new things that he's doing and the things that he will do, even in the midst of the pain and the suffering that we experience here and now, the brokenness that is in our world. What kind of world is it where resurrection is not only possible, but where it's promised? What kind of world do we live in? What kind of God do we have? Now, all of this, what does it have to do with us today? I think one of the things that it does, alongside of drawing us into the grand cosmic reality of what God is going to do for the entire universe one day, I think another one of the things that it does is it shows us this intimate personal interaction with Mary in the midst of her trauma and grief and confusion. And it brings it down to a level, at least for me, I can see that, I can picture that, I can understand that a little bit. And to see how his presence and his words speak hope and life into her situation. Oh, I believe that he still does this today. Our God is a God of resurrection. He's a God of new life. He's a God of new possibilities, a God of hope. And you and I are invited to live in light of that. Let's bow our heads in prayer. Jesus, we come to you this morning. And like I said, resurrection can seem like such an abstract idea. It's something that none of us have ever witnessed before. And Lord, the things that you promise in the scriptures about making all things new, I can't even begin to fathom and picture what that looks like. But one thing we can do is we can come to you and we can say, Jesus, what you have done, what you have accomplished, may that be true for me. May that be true for us. May we live in light of the resurrection. May we live in light of all that you've done and all you've accomplished, so that we may see your world yet to come in all of its fullness